phases of the project, it's going to face all the same hurdles that any other large-scale industrial project is going to face. And what I'm talking about today is really more something dealing with a large-scale solar project as opposed to distributed PV projects. But I'd like to also think about how some of these things, and discuss how some of these things might relate for any type of launching of a new energy venture. So we see, I used the abbreviation at the top there, NIMBY, not in my backyard. And that applies to anybody who's looking at projects. Is great. I love renewable energy. I really want to see lots of renewable energy projects. I just don't want it in my backyard. What matters to me is my local area, and I'm concerned about the impact you're going to have on my local area. We have to worry about the effect on property values, about landscapes that used to be rural and have a nice vista, and now they're going to have facilities sitting on them. Aesthetics. People are very concerned about the aesthetic aspects of a project, whether it's noise, visual impact, all of those types of effects are compounded if it's an area that has tourism. So the effects on tourism for that area. The land footprint. For solar projects, very often the land footprint is quite large in comparison to other forms of energy. And so that has a particular impact for the large solar projects. Air and water quality. Those are not as much of a factor for renewable energy projects. You have to consider, for example, the air quality aspects of construction. If you have a number of trucks moving in and out during the construction phase with their emissions, with the dust that they kick up, all of those kinds of things need to be factored into the environmental planning process. Water consumption, the cooling facilities, for example, for a major solar project, that is a water-cooled facility. Then water consumption in a desert region can be a major factor, and that's something that will need to be considered through the planning process. Sensitive lands. Again, many of the solar projects are considered in desert areas. Those have very fragile ecosystems with plants and animals that are adapted to that climate that may be very unique. So you often have endangered species issues that arise from the location in a desert area for a solar project. Historic preservation. In many areas, the consideration of the history of an area can be very important, and in many countries, the law has specific protection for historic areas. And so if you are impacting large land use, and especially if you also consider transmission lines and other related aspects of a project, you may have a historic area you need to be concerned about. Wildlife habitat, I've already mentioned that endangered wildlife can be a significant issue. Here in the U.S., if you have an endangered species, whether it's a plant or an animal, especially an animal, that can be something that can stop a project. And so knowing about any of that in advance, making sure that an area has been thoroughly studied, is quite important to the permitting process. And then cumulative impacts. Maybe one solar facility is great. The second solar facility may encroach further on wildlife habitat. It may have more air quality impacts. It may impact the water supply even more. And 3 or 4 in an area start to have even more of an impact. And so the impact over time from a number of facilities located in the same area has to be considered in environmental planning. And finally, decommissioning. what happens when that facility has reached the end of its useful life and has to be taken down or reused for something else. That often has to be planned at the very beginning of the process. And so as you're doing planning, you have to go through all of those things. Now, I'll come back in more detail to different aspects of this, but I wanted to run through this overall quite quickly. So, in preparing for a major project, careful planning is extremely important. And so at the beginning phase, whoever is looking at that has to go through all of the various aspects of the project and think about what kinds of environmental impacts are going to occur, what other sites might be considered. It might be that you have one site that is very close to an urban area. Well, that's terrific because you don't have to have transmission lines that are as long. It's an area, for example, where there was already an industrial facility. And so you don't have a lot of the same concerns that arise when there is a new area that you're breaking ground, where there's already wildlife habitat established, where you have a pristine environment that's being disturbed. On the other hand, if you're close to an urban area, you have more people saying, don't build it here, it's a vacant lot, but I like the vacant lot, and I don't want to have it right next to where I'm living. And so there are trade-offs for each possible site, and you need to consider which of those areas is likely to be the best site. What groups of people are affected? We'll come back to that one in more detail. What government agencies are involved? Again, we'll come back to that in some more detail. What are the public attitudes toward the project? You may have a public that says, we love renewable energy, and we want to see this project. If you're building something close to Boulder, Colorado, people like renewable energy. They're very concerned about their environment. So how are they going to feel about a new project being built in this area? What are the project economics? That's something we will come back to again at the later part of this discussion. That's something that, since I'm assuming most of you are really focusing on the research phase of things, the research phase needs to bear in mind what is going to happen later on with the economics of actually building a project. So I'll come back to that again. And then how do those things differ from site to site? So I've talked enough. Now, think about a new project. Let's say this is a concentrating solar project, and it is being built in an area that is near a major city but not that close. So what are the kinds of groups of people who might be affected by that project? So, audience participation time. Yes?
Well, everybody who lives in a circle of X miles around this plant. Well, I don't know how far one should go, but everybody who lives in the area, the people in the big city, the people in the small village next to it. Yes.
Good. Okay. Nearby residents. Who else? Come on.
People who probably work there.
I'm sorry?
People who might probably work there later on.
Okay, people who might visit the area.
Work there.
Oh, work there. Yes, yes, very important. The labor force. That's a very important aspect of who would be affected by it. Who else? Come on, I know it's late in the afternoon. Wake up here. Industry. Yes, that's quite true. Other industries. Okay, well, I'll make it easy on you. This is my list. So it might be the people who are nearby. We've got the labor groups are on there. The other industries. Now you might have some industries that are going to benefit. And that can be everybody from raw material suppliers or manufacturers or trucking companies. It can be the people in the donut shop. We're going to sell more donuts because there will be construction workers there. And so there are all types of facilities that are of industries that can be benefited. On the other hand, you can have those who see the new facility as competition. You might have the coal mining company that's down the road that wants to do everything to avoid your project coming online. And so that's also has to be considered, the pro and con on industries. You have, very often when you're talking about areas that are the wide open spaces, you have indigenous groups that live in those areas. And they may have unique rights to the land. In the US, there might be an Indian reservation where they actually have essentially an ownership interest. There might also be traditional hunting grounds or fishing grounds. In Canada, there are areas where the First Nations may not own the property or have a reservation there. They have a recognized legal right to participate in the process. And so you have to consider those kinds of aspects. Again, we mentioned the tourist, historic preservation groups. You have the environmental, non-governmental organizations who can play a very powerful role in the process. And we'll talk about them some more. You have the government agencies, the labor force. You might have the construction labor force that is non-skilled labor that can be drawn from the overall area. But you may also need to have very skilled and specifically skilled workers. In the project I was involved with Shell, as with many other large projects, if you're going into an area that does not already have a skilled labor pool, you may have to think years in advance and start working with community colleges, for example, to start training people who would acquire the skills that you would need when the project is built several years down the road. And so it requires a lot of advanced planning to have your labor force in place. Electric utilities. They may love having the renewable energy project. They may view it as a pain in the neck because it is going to require adjustments to their system. And so they may welcome it, they may do everything they can to connect with it, or they may not. They may be well equipped to handle a new source of power. Again, they may not. And so that is a group that will require a great deal of effort in the interaction. And then finally, you have to have your market. Who is going to be using the power generated by this facility? So how is that going to relate to the fluctuation in the power supply, the cost of the power? What are the competing sources of power for the industries in the area, for the local communities? So all of those things have to be considered as a project is just in its beginning phases. Land use impacts. This gets back to the not in my backyard syndrome. One of the things we can learn from a theory or a school of economics called political economy is that people who are focused can have a greater impact on the outcome of a democratic process or of a political process in general than the people who are widely affected but in a small degree. And so if you have people who are concerned because they don't want a project in their backyard, even though the wide range of people may say we really want to have renewable energy, that local group is really going to be spending all of their time and effort trying to oppose it. And so that little group, because they're really motivated and they're really going to be involved in the process, may have more influence than the broad scale. Okay, dealing with governments. This is another audience participation moment here. So what I'd like you to do is to think about all the various types of governments and government players that might be involved in approving a project or just being involved in the setup of a new project. So, yes.
Maybe funding agencies?
I'm sorry?
Funding agencies?
All right, yes?
Department of Energy?
Everybody has to speak up here.
Marketing agencies?
Yes, okay? All right, and you,
I say the Department of Energy probably.
okay. All right. What else?
EPA?
Okay? What else?
City
State
council.
governments, local governments.
Yep, yes, yes, local governments. All right, again, I'll give you a little bit of time off here. I'll start going through my list. First of all, you have local officials. In the US at least, local officials have the responsibility for land use planning. And so they're the ones that can say, yes, this is an area appropriate for a major facility, or no, it's not. And so while the federal government may think something is a great idea, for the most part, it's the local governments that say where it can be located. And so they go through their own local process, they have their own local rules and regulations about how that is going to operate. They're going to be thinking about it from the perspective of a local resident. And so they'll look at it and say, gee, we're going to have a whole bunch of new families moving in here. That means there's going to be more demand for hospitals and for schools and for roads. And we don't have the money to build those things. And so they may view it as a negative in that way to have a new project come in. On the other hand, they may look at it and say, new jobs, this is great. We're going to have lots more new jobs here. And so they may welcome it. You're going to see, especially, one thing that applies to all types of PV and other kinds of solar facilities. Those are the ones that control, those local officials are the ones who control the building codes. And so if you're talking about a facility that's going to be constructed on a building, if you want to put a solar panel on the roof of a building, the codes that say how that is going to be installed and what standards it's going to meet and whether it's permissible to put a solar panel on the roof of a building, those things are going to be controlled by a local government. And so it's important to factor them into the process. State officials. They have responsibility to a large extent for environmental regulation. And while there are nationwide laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, it is the state officials who have been delegated authority by the federal government to apply those laws. And so those local officials, to a large extent, look at the federal law, but they factor in their own local circumstances. And so the approvals you would need to get are very often from state agencies. You have agencies that deal with economic regulation, like public utility commissions. They're the ones who are going to be involved in deciding some of the details of how a solar facility would connect with the electric system. And so those can be very important players. Tax issues can really apply federal, state, or local, but the state can have a great deal to say about taxation. And you need to deal with state agencies, you also need to deal with elected officials. The elected officials may have a somewhat different perspective on it than the agency officials do. And I'll come back to this, but with all of these things, what's important is to remember in planning a facility, from the very beginning you have to start communicating with all these different groups to get them to support your facility. On the federal level, we have the executive branch, which is headed by the president. And that's where all of the regulatory agencies are found that we usually think of. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Department of Energy, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of the Interior, all of those report to the President. Each of them has a great deal of autonomy in its ability to apply its regulations. They go through a process of writing up regulations, but then as that applies to the individual permit, they have the ability to like it or not like it and apply some subtle differences depending on how they perceive the project. There may be incentives for different types of energy projects. Those are often set at either the local level, where local officials are competing with other local governments to attract a facility so they can get jobs, or at the federal level trying to look at overall policies and to support renewable energy, for example. And in Congress, you have Congress, of course, that sets the broad legislation that guides what the agencies can do. And so their role is pretty straightforward in writing the laws. But they also have a great deal of ability to finagle, to have laws that might apply to specific projects. For example, if there is a facility where one market for the power might be an Air Force base, a member of Congress could write a little piece of legislation that says such and such an Air Force base is required to examine supplying or getting its power supply from a solar energy facility. And so, while some of that is frowned upon if it's too specific, that still is the kind of thing that a member of Congress can do. And so, a great deal of attention needs to be paid to members of Congress. And the other thing is they care about their local districts. And so if it's going to have a big impact in their local district, they want to know about it, they may support it, or if they oppose it, that can be devastating. Environmental organizations. When you think of environmental organizations, there's a tendency to think that they're all going to be in agreement. And it's clearly not the case. You see some renewable energy projects where one environmental group may support it, another one may oppose it. We saw this in northeastern United States. There was an offshore wind energy facility proposed, and the national environmental group said, great, this is wind energy, it's terrific. The local group said, not here. This is a place we love, we don't want it, we're going to protest about it. And so that difference of opinion, the national versus local, can play out with the environmental groups. You can have some that are very focused on climate change. So they're going to look at it from the big picture perspective and what the impact might be on climate change. You might have some that are very focused on wildlife. So no matter how great the climate change argument may be, if a solar facility is going to impact the desert tortoise, they oppose it. And so there, again, it depends on what their emphasis might be. Some of them are very concerned about process. They don't want anybody to get a short circuit through the approval process. And so they may be very concerned that each project is having to go through exactly the same process as opposed to anything that would short circuit it. Some of the environmental groups are very interested in litigation. They want to stop projects, and so they file lawsuits to try and prevent those projects. Others are much more concerned about broad policy. Others, again, are concerned about their local area. Some may be very willing to sit down with the people who want to build a project and agree upon some of the issues and how those issues might be resolved. That they would support the project if the transmission line runs through this route but not that route. There might be other things that could be negotiated. But some don't want to negotiate. Some really are concerned with their issue and their ability to block any kind of industrial type facility. And so it's important to think about the different types of environmental groups that you might encounter. Now, this is sort of an overview of what you would need to go through in preparing for that project. You obviously have to think about all this up front and think about how your project is planned to avoid as many obstacles as possible. You have to reach out to all of these different groups that I have just described and to talk to them about what the project will and will not do, to be very accurate and upfront in describing what the impacts of the project are going to be, to figure out what the jobs are that are going to be created, what the benefits might be, but also what the problems might be. If you are going to bring in a new workforce during the construction time frame, and it's going to have a big impact on the school system, maybe you need to work with the local governments to find a way to bring in some help for the school system during that time. You have to think about all those things. All of these various issues that can come up can all delay a project. As you delay a project, that has an impact on when the money starts flowing in from a project. It has a big effect on the economics of the project. So you have to factor that in as you're planning and develop contingency plans. This is where I sort of shift from the political process to the process that a company goes through as it is looking at launching a new project, or it can also be for a new product line. And so this really, I think a lot of this might apply whatever type of solar facility or product you're talking about. One of the things that I saw when I was working with the scientists at Royal Dutch Shell was that things worked really well at the laboratory phase. But just because something worked really well at the laboratory phase didn't necessarily mean that quickly it could be translated into the field. And that's why as new industries launch, as major companies look at starting up a process, they go through the small scale to the next bigger scale, to the next bigger scale, to the next bigger scale, to see how all of it works together. And if you try to leap over some of those things, sometimes that can end up causing failures for the project. Many times as I deal with people in the wider world, especially with policymakers, people think, well, you know, we've got this technology, it's wonderful technology, let's implement it tomorrow. And it just doesn't happen that way. You have to go through a process. So if you are going to build a big facility, you have to have enough technological certainty to be able to move ahead on a large scale. That's where you get the trial and error of having gone through the pilot projects. It's to give you that certainty. You have to know how all the different moving parts are going to fit together. In one of today's projects, you may have parts of the equipment and the process and the know-how coming from as many places as are represented in this room today. And if each of you try to bring your part together without carefully planning how it all fits, it just may not work. And so you have to be sure that each of these pieces is all going to work together. And it's one thing if you're doing it on a small scale. But if you are bringing in a piece of the project that is a $20 million piece of equipment, and suddenly you realize that that doesn't work exactly like you thought it did, then that, again, can be a disaster for the project. And so You have to make sure that all those pieces fit together. You have to look at how that equipment is going to be manufactured on a large scale. If you're talking about something that can be replicated place after place after place, where do you get the raw materials? Where do you want to manufacture it? What places in the world are going to be the most cost-effective places to find that equipment and to manufacture it? What type of engineers or scientists or commercial people do you need to have in place to make all of that work? How do you get the raw materials on the kind of large scale you're going to need? And is your purchase of those raw materials or of that specialized equipment going to cause a change in the price in and of itself, just because your demand or the demand of a few other facilities like yours are going to cause a change in the price of that? The other point is the financial investment side. You have different layers of investors who are going to have different risk tolerances. You have the angel investor, the investor who is investing at the very early phase. They're fine with lots of risk. That's what they accept in the process. And they may not have a very fast time frame in which they expect to get things done. The further you move up the scale towards investors who have more money invested, then you need to have more certainty. If you look at the oil and gas industry and you see a major, for example, offshore oil platform being constructed and put into place, that's a several billion-dollar investment. And even if you're looking at ExxonMobil or Royal Dutch Shell or whoever, a major company, they don't do that whole project themselves. They bring in other companies as partners because they want to minimize that risk. And so to do a large-scale energy project, you're probably going to have lots of different partners involved in that process. And those partners are going to want to understand exactly what their investment risks are going to be. If you have delays in the project because you have decided on a great piece of land that is the habitat of that desert tortoise, and you think you're going to get all of your approvals by 2014, and somebody comes in and files a lawsuit that delays it until 2016, you have millions upon millions of dollars of interest cost on the money you've borrowed in the process, the people that you have hired, the manufacturing facilities that are sitting there waiting to produce your product, all of those kinds of things. So if you think that you can move things along quickly and you find out you cannot, your whole project may fall apart. And so it's very important to have all of that constant interaction with the stakeholders to understand who may support it and who may oppose it and why, what they're likely to do, what the time frames are likely to be. When you're dealing with government agencies, for the most part, they don't care what your process time is. They don't care that your whole thing is being delayed. If they need to go through the paperwork and you haven't gone through the paperwork, then they don't care. And so it's up to those who are planning a project to make sure they have factored all of those things in and done their homework as much as possible. The cost of inputs is going to make a big difference to the investors. And from those of you who are looking from the research phase or the early phase of planning for a project, are there some ways other than designing a whole set of unique equipment for your particular facility? Can you rely on some off-the-shelf technology that you can go and buy when it's necessary without having to have it produced in advance? Are there some ways of minimizing the risk by using resources that are readily available? Are there some efficiencies that you can look at? Again, from the research perspective, you don't really think about if I make it out of this particular component as opposed to another one, if I make it from this substance as opposed to another one, is the cost going to be affected? That has a huge impact on whether it is really going to operate well in the real world. And so those kinds of things are helpful for those who are doing the research into things to understand, so that it actually comes to reality at the end of the process. And what is the market going to be? We've just had a tremendous example in the natural resource area of supply and demand in the market. There are many companies that built drilled new natural gas wells, looking at the price and thinking it was going to be about $4. And now it's down well under $3 and occasionally dipping under $2. And suddenly their project economics don't look nearly as good as they were. They are affected by their own ingenuity and success. There's now a great deal of supply, and that can have an effect on the price. And so again, with solar facilities, that may be tremendous for the public who benefits from low cost of energy, but it can make it difficult in planning new projects if the price goes down. So I've gone through about 95 different things that you might want to consider in looking at a project, but I think it's important to understand the time frames involved, the complexity of trying to get new projects put together, the reality for why it sometimes takes a whole lot longer for good ideas to become reality than you might originally think. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Happy to do questions.
I'm curious, in comparison to fossil fuel projects, if there are any differences in terms of how quickly a project can get moving toward renewable energy?
If a fossil fuel project is using new technologies, then it is probably going to have some of the same obstacles that arise with renewable technologies. If any type of new technology creates new issues for regulators. If you are looking at the 250th natural gas well being drilled in an area, you can pretty much tell what the impacts are going to be. You've studied the water quality, the air quality, all of that can be easily quantified. If you're doing the first one, it's a whole lot more difficult. And so you don't have the baseline of data. Much of our environmental analysis and permitting depends on having that baseline of data. And if you're speculating about what the effects are going to be, then it makes it very easy for somebody else to come in, either in the administrative process or in litigation, and say, they guessed about what the impacts were going to be, they guessed wrong. They didn't have enough basis for it. And so it makes it more difficult when you're talking about new technologies.
And just to follow up to that, in a bad economy, have you, I guess we were for 6 years, did you see a change in attitudes in terms of local groups and governments really kind of minimizing red tape type issues?
Yes. Yeah, the question was whether the economy has made a big difference in the attitudes of regulators, especially local regulators. It certainly has. It used to be that the aesthetics might predominate. Today, it's the jobs. And so there is much more concern about finding ways to employ people than there was 5 or 6 years ago. And so I think that has made a difference. It has made a difference in immediate attitudes. It hasn't made as much difference in terms of real changes in the process. You have haven't really seen a lot of streamlining taking place that would revamp the process to move things along. There has been some of that, but not as much as frankly I would have expected.
Thank you.
Yes?
What you just said about renewables being new technologies kind of sounds like the problem is that people don't have experience with it. So the local governments, the state governments aren't used to projects of this kind because they're more used to other projects. How much do these baseline data you need also look at other places where this has been done before, other states, other countries? I mean, it's not necessarily new everywhere.
Yes.
So how much do local and state governments or all kinds of involved parties look at experiences from elsewhere, or how much do they just rely on the local experience?
The question was how much will regulators look at the experience in other areas, other countries, where the renewable technologies have already been developed and utilized in trying to develop their baseline. It's much easier within the U.S. because the environmental planning process, the National Environmental Policy Act, environmental impact statements, are designed to be able to look at information that is in other environmental analyses elsewhere. And so it's a little bit easier to draw from the U.S. When you are drawing more broadly, you can look at scientific expertise and studies that have been done elsewhere. So it is useful, and it's certainly useful for a company to develop that information and to bring it in. So that can be helpful. It can also be helpful from biological perspective if you have seen other places where there are similar desert environments, for example, and you can study similar animals and what the effect is. That may be helpful, but it may not. Right? So to a certain amount, to a certain extent, it depends on the particular local ecosystem that's involved. But when you're talking about things like emissions or heat generated or the type of materials that are being utilized, whatever, those kinds of things can be very helpful.
That's a contentious question.
Yes?
Make a comment that all of these facilities are going to be very close to where people live, which brings on all these problems. Middle of the 20th century, the Bureau of Reclamation dammed lots of rivers, made water available where there were no people, lots of hydroelectric power where there were no people. So why can not the current renewable energy learn from that process? Why do we not put wind farms where there are no people and solar farms where there are no people? What's changed?
That's a great question. The question for anybody who didn't hear it, the Bureau of Reclamation in the U.S. used to build dams way out in the middle of the desert, build huge dams, no people there, they'd supply irrigation water. Most of California, for example, had very little agriculture until they started building dams and then putting in irrigated agriculture, bringing people into those places. And why doesn't the same thing happen with solar energy? You build a facility and then people come in, and so nobody's bothered by it, they're attracted by it. We've changed so much on our environmental attitudes is one of the big things. Now, the places that used to be considered sort of excess waste land are now very highly valued by somebody. And our endangered species laws, for example, are written to protect species that inhabit areas that are not populated. In fact, if you look at our list of endangered species and where that has an impact, the impact of the endangered species laws is much more in the sparsely settled areas, because that's where the wildlife is. When you look at New York City, nothing is affected in New York City by the endangered species laws because there isn't any wildlife there. And so we have changed in our attitudes and in our laws. We have much more of a value today for wildlands than we used to. And so that aspect of it has changed as well.
So, how much cost do you estimate gonna account from those soft factors for a huge project? For example, you have a project which will cost like $10 million, and how much will be accounted from the like the delay of talking with the government and also the environmental regulations? So those soft factors, yeah.
How much of a part of the project cost is going to be the environmental analysis and so forth? It depends a great deal, and I don't have those figures off the top of my head, but it can be very large. When you look at the planning process, it's not unusual for companies to spend 40 or 50 or $100 million just in the planning process for this, and writing preparing all the environmental analysis, doing the outreach, doing some research that might be necessary. You might, for example, have to do research on a species to see how many of the particular type of wildlife are located in an area, and study them over several years to see what the effect is on their population. You might have to do, there's a great deal of scientific work that goes into the planning process. And so for an average major facility, just the analysis that is done, the environmental impact analysis is usually a book, set of books that high, about a foot high set of books, and then that may not consider all of the factors. That's just one aspect of it. So it can easily be tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars up front.
But do you have a number for the total cost of the project, like maybe 50% of the total cost for a huge project?
It's probably not anywhere close to that. I mean, I would say, I'm making a wild guess, but it probably is only like 5% of the project. So it's usually a fairly small part, but it can be enough that it causes the project to no longer be economic.
The thing is, don't hire people and don't borrow money till most of this is taken care of, right?
Yes. Yes.
Excuse me, I have a question. How can economic crisis affect on advent of new technology in mega scales? I mean, is that possible that they stop investing on some new technology which is really necessary or really is helpful for some country in case of having economic crisis? Is at the top of the list for just stopping investment, or is there any other strategy?
Very often it's tomorrow's projects that are delayed when you have an economic crisis. And so the effect of an economic crisis can be putting off those things that might provide jobs or provide a low-cost source of energy in the future. And so, and especially if you're looking at your government incentives or local government investment or something like that, that is the government spending money, that can end up causing a delay. If you're looking at the people who do the paperwork, the government officials that are necessary to review all of this information and to make the decisions, if the government agencies have cut back on what they're doing, they may decide to do the projects that are going to be coming online quickly. and to delay those things that are in the long distant future. And so that may also cause some delays. You would tend to think that if a project is going to create jobs and going to make the economy better, that would be a high priority. But if agencies don't have the money for anything but their absolute essential current needs, they often cut back and don't do those new projects. And certainly, when you're talking again about the investors, there are some advantages, because right now, if you want to borrow money, if you're building a project today and you want to borrow money that you're going to be paying off over the next 30 years, this is a great time to get a loan at a very low percentage. And so there are some benefits today. But, and if you want to enter into a construction contract, a firm construction contract today may be very attractive to a company to commit to. And so there are both pluses and minuses that come about because of the economic situation. Yes?
One more after this.
I was gonna ask, who does all that work? I can't imagine that a company will suddenly have environmental scientists and all these people employed. Are there like consultancy people doing this, or how does it work? I mean, yeah, where do
Okay.
people come from?
The question was about who does all of this work. There are a lot of very specialized companies that are consulting companies that know all about these processes. And they might specialize in projects just in Colorado or California and really know the process in Colorado or California. There are biologists who understand a particular species that might be located at your site, so you can hire a biologist who knows about that. There are companies that, consulting firms, that coordinate this whole process. And so there are a number of both very large to very small companies that work on these kinds of planning processes. There are a number of global companies that do this sort of thing and can do work in a variety of different countries.
One more question.
Oh, you're letting me off easy.
Letting her off easy. Now, but you're going to join us for dinner, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I have the authority to take along 3 students, and I guess say the first 3 hands that go up are the 3 that go to dinner with us. There's 1. There's 2. Looking for number 3. There's 3. Okay, good. We will, anyway, thank Gale very much.